BBC's The War of the Worlds miniseries came out 6 years ago now, which led to my first ever War of the Worlds video in which I said this series was terrible, but could have been great. Well, a lot's happened since 2019. Of course, it turned out to simply be the first of many adaptations of an iconic story that had just entered the public domain, and many of them are notoriously bad. I haven't actually seen that one yet, so that's going to be interesting, or boring, as I suspect the case may be. This has often made me reconsider my feelings on the BBC's version over the years, as each adaptation just seems to get worse and worse. That combined with the fact that my tone has definitely subdued somewhat since that first video, which was more of a roast than a review, has prompted me to re-watch and re-evaluate the 3-part miniseries, which features main characters George and Amy living in and about to get hit by a Martian projectile Edwardian Woking, with their dog Benny, which is ironic considering my username, never noticed that before. The astronomer Ogilvy is also there, and the main character has a brother who's featured prominently as well. These combined with the period setting and the location setting already makes this series far more accurate, at least in these respects, than most of the other versions that have come out. Well, I say period setting, is it me or is Ogilvy wearing screen glare reflection protection glasses? Man, he was really ahead of his time. I won't go too much into the plot, mainly because this is meant to be a positive review. That's a joke, and so is the writing. Yet despite me warming up considerably to this show, I still agree with a lot of the negative points I made previously, but there's a lot of good with this show, so it's only fair I do this video revisiting it, especially considering the amount of time that went into making this series. It was initially announced all the way back in December 2015, and seemingly had quite a rough development, as it was meant to come out 3 years later in 2018, but got delayed to allow more work to be carried out on post-production CGI and special effects. Weirdly, this BBC series finally ended up being aired first in Canada in October 2019, before nearly 2 months later finally arriving in Britain itself. When you take into account the amount of effort that would have gone into not only trying to portray an alien invasion, but also to do so in its period setting, it's understandable that it got held back for so long. And that's not even taking into account the fact that this show chooses to have segments set 5 years after the invasion, in an entirely different decayed and destroyed London that's dramatically transformed. I mean, I personally hate the future segments. I think most people do from what I've seen. I'm just saying that certainly would have significantly added to the workload. They did a really good job of creating a claustrophobic and depressing atmosphere, with the destroyed London being very grim, yet colourful in some ways, such as when the sky turns purple. It's bleak, yet oddly beautiful in its own way. Indeed, one of the things I regret not mentioning much in my last review was the set design. It may be one of my favourite aspects of the show. For me, the Edwardian Woking is easily the highlight. Such a stunning setting, and they did a really good job of capturing that old look. The shots of this period London look very epic too, but there's a lot of dodgy CGI in this show. It's weird, some of it looks incredible and is really well done, but there's enough bad CGI to make it known as a series that has bad CGI, from what I gathered. Some of it just really stands out. Like, you can tell a mile off that that's not really Tower Bridge, and is instead a 3D model of Tower Bridge. Weirdly, despite what you'd expect, the tripods aren't one of the things that sticks out too much in this way, I'd say. They generally look pretty good. And although not necessarily accurate, although what ones are, they're a pretty cool, creepy design. They're not my favourite, but I certainly don't think they're bad. In fact, they were one of the few things I was positive about in my first review. They're very menacing, and just, again, the word that crops up is creepy. Seeing them in a distance going about London or on the beach, there's some very cool shots of them that just look really good. And I also like the way that, just like in the novel, they're not indestructible. We do see the Royal Navy take out a couple, which is an accurate detail that surprisingly is hardly ever replicated. dedicated, yet we have it here. On the other hand, one detail that isn't so accurate is the fact that the cylinders are now spheres, which isn't a big deal, I don't mind it personally. I'm only bringing it up as they're notable as being one of the CGI elements that blatantly looks like CGI. Weirdly, to me, this is the case even when it's in the ground, covered in that rock or whatever. It somehow looks really fake, even though they actually built this for real, which also just shows how dedicated they were. Maybe they applied significant effects to it or something like that, or maybe my CGIs are just doing a bad job. On the other hand, the heat ray produced by the cylinder sphere is certainly the most realistic and well done version of it that's ever appeared on screen, or not appeared rather. Indeed, what's notable about it is that you can't really see it, which makes sense. It's a heat ray, it fires heat. Why is it always portrayed as a beam? It's like the sonic screwdriver, why does it have a light on it if it works with sound? Well, same reason, because it's easier to depict on television. In fact, the tripod's heat rays do have beams, but still, I really like that they initially went with the effectively invisible heat ray, which is portrayed pretty much exactly as the book describes. A bright glare leaping from one to another sprang from a scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man was suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that little distant crowd, an almost noiseless and blinding flash of light. It's probably my favourite heat ray depiction ever. Even back then I thought it was a really great effect that just looked really realistic and just makes sense. Which brings me back onto one of my big criticisms I had years ago, which was that this adaptation didn't seem very accurate to me at the time. Yet, as we've established, this is kind of a very unfair thing to say, considering just how book accurate details like that are. But it is also a very fair thing to say in many other ways. Although the BBC makes some drastic changes, I'd say the first half of this miniseries, especially compared to the other adaptations that have come since, is faithful to be fair. But that's really only if you take away all the extra stuff that they added in, like the romantic subplot between George and Amy and all that. The trouble is, the extra stuff that they added in comprises most of the bloody show. So if you only left in the things that were accurate, or even just relating to the main invasion, you generally only have like possibly even less than half of the show left. I'm not even exaggerating, I've done the calculations. At best you'd be left with like 55%. Now it is an adaptation after all, so you don't mind this sort of thing to a degree. It's based on a work, right? So that's to be expected, that it does its own thing. But I feel like, I was gonna say it's gone that extra step too far beyond its source material, but I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is actually the way these changes fit into the show that's the primary problem. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but the way and the level to which they've made their changes just doesn't work very well. The focus on the romance goes way too far, for example, to the point of getting in the way of what should be the main storyline. It's less of a subplot and more of a dom plot. Is that a term? Probably shouldn't be. Okay, no one's invented that word yet, and apparently there isn't a singular word for a plot line that was clearly intended to be a subplot but overshadows the main plot. Until now. Anyway, I keep trying to compare my thoughts on these aspects of the BBC's version to the 2005 Tom Cruise film, because as someone who quite likes that one, to be honest, I'm trying to expose my own hypocrisy and see, you know, am I being unfair against the BBC series? So for instance, you could argue, well, the Tom Cruise one also added a lot of stuff, the family relationships and all that, but at no point in my experience of watching it does it feel to me like the relationships in that film overshadow the fact that there's a bloody invasion going on and they're just trying to survive. I don't think I can say the same about the BBC version, where literally the main characters stop in the middle of a street while they're on high alert to have a chat about extramarital affairs. I said last time, to me it feels like they wanted to do an Edwardian romantic drama and just put the War of the Worlds in the background to get people interested in it. However, I think a more accurate correct way of describing what happened was they wanted to do The War of the Worlds faithfully but for a modern audience, but then they poorly executed the changes that they felt needed to be made to do that. For example, the writer Peter Harness said, "I think the clearest choice that I made from the start of this project was to give the male character a wife who had a strength of character in her own right." Okay, but then what happened was he went way overboard in trying to do this, to the point he made the now two lead roles romance the focus over the actual story he was meant to be telling. He went on to say, "It was very important for me to make the female character three-dimensional. Whenever I write, I try and focus on having a strong female lead in it, because I think it should be the natural way of doing things. I've written the character of Amy as a lot stronger and more practical than George. I like Amy because I feel that she is a character I've invented from scratch." Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but I feel like that last line in particular is a hint that he's more interested in doing his own thing rather than the story he's adapting, which is definitely how the series feels when watching it at least. I think this is shown by what Peter Harness said further. "I didn't want to write another sci-fi series where a man is getting into scrapes and, like in the book, packs his wife away out of harm's way and doesn't see her until the very end." Well, yeah, but if Wells hadn't written it that way, it would have been a completely different story, wouldn't it? Now, I'm not suggesting it's impossible to write The War of the Worlds with the wife being present. Of course that can be done. I've literally seen people write spin-off novels of the story but from the wife's perspective. I'm just pointing out that Peter Harness is apparently not the guy to do that because he falls into the basic trap of then having that relationship consume the entire story. I mean, there is a romantic storyline in the original book to a degree. The narrator is often longing for his wife and is trying to get back to her. But a romance story was not what Wells was trying to tell with The War of the Worlds. In fact, I just realised you've literally got the 1953 film version that has romance as a core plot, but again, it doesn't get in the way of the story. So we literally have an example of how it is very possible to have romance be a key part of an adaptation. Once again, it's not what the BBC version does that's the problem, it's how it does it. If you want to add a romantic plot and a female lead to The War of the Worlds, you can easily do that very well, but you probably wouldn't add all this, "Oh, we're not really married," and all that stuff that's not only irrelevant but boring. What that all was really, though, was just one of the many methods the writer used to showcase the people that lived in 1904 being judgmental, so he can show how arrogant and bad everyone was back then. Nearly everyone in this show, except George and Amy, who have modern ideas of course, are portrayed as being arrogant and bad. It's meant to be smart commentary, yet it backfires. Because they're portrayed as being so ludicrously over-the-top arrogant and bad that it's like watching a pantomime villain. It really isn't having the effect the writer seems to think it does. It's not clever commentary, it's one-dimensional, everything is black and white with barely any nuanced characterization, which is kind of important when you're doing it as commentary. If there's one thing so-called intellectual writers of the modern day love to do, it's smugly look down on the inferior societies that came before them and point out how bad they and everyone living within them were. And it's like, well, it's easy to do that and feel clever when you've had over a century's worth of knowledge and advancement over the people you're disparaging. It's like an adult calling a baby stupid for not being able to walk or talk. It's like, sure, technically you're right, you are better than the baby, but you're not being clever by pointing this out. Ironically, George and Amy often appear equally arrogant, albeit unintentionally. Since the writing lacks nuance, their confident assertions come across as arrogance, as they frequently express ideas with a certainty they don't logically possess at that time. It's like when George briefly helps the army. So for context, George is wandering around looking for Amy and he encounters the army. Looks for Amy, finds the army. One letter off. Hard luck. What can you do? Well, obviously the colonel, whatever he is made out to be arrogant and bad to an unrealistic degree, as most of the characters are. The invasion literally began like a half a day before, but for some reason this guy is so desperate for volunteers, when George refuses to help him, he recruits him at gunpoint, and is like, "Do your duty for your king and country, you coward." So this whole situation is entirely unrealistic, from what I understand anyway, and doesn't make the slightest slightest bit of sense. Well, until you remember that the writer just wants to make everyone look arrogant and bad. So the army are ordered to destroy the second cylinder. Now George has seen the first cylinder, sphere, and seen it kill everyone. So he's like, oh no, Colonel, don't attack the sphere. I've seen it, you can't stop it. And this isn't even an egregious example, by the way, but what's going through my head is, how do you know you can't stop it, George? Did you try and blow it up the last time? No. So for all you know, the army attacking it when it's dormant before it gets activated and starts killing everyone might actually work. Now obviously that doesn't end up being the case, because the army is wrong with all their arrogance and badness and they all end up dead, obviously. But I'm just saying, it makes the main characters seem arrogant, because they're designed to be overtly right beyond their knowledge, in addition to everyone else being portrayed as wrong, yet thinking they're right. I know this was meant to be a more positive review, and there's a lot I really do like about this series. The music, for instance, there's a couple of really good tracks in there, but undoubtedly the writing sucks, and I feel this deserves to be said. I thought it sucked at the time, and I still think it sucks 6 years later. There's so much the writer just decided to add in to the point it detracts the show's focus. And in case you think I'm exaggerating, just a reminder of some of the stuff that's in this show. There's a whole plot about, oh, they keep referring to each other as husband and wife, but they're not actually married, and George is trying to get a divorce from his real wife, but she won't let him because she wants to get back at him for leaving her for Amy. And they're really sad about that, but this also affects George's job as it tarnishes his reputation, causing the newspaper he works for to refuse to print any of the articles he writes under his name and instead credits them to Arnold Henderson, which is a nice little reference I've somehow only just realised to Henderson the journalist from the book. And Amy thinks George should quit his job, but George wonders what they would live on if he left. And she's like, we can live off my daddy's money. And he's like, no, that wouldn't be progressive of us to do that. And she says, oh, it would be perfectly progressive. But it's weird to me that they're worried about money when they literally have a living maid. Ciri from The Witcher, before she was famous, was their maid. So anyway, rumours about them not really being married spread throughout the town, which they've just moved into, by the way. And people keep realising this, and society disapproves, and as a result they're finding it really hard to feel welcome in Woking. And I can't resist the pun, speaking of Woking, Ogilvy's gay, by the way. I'm just mentioning all of this stuff as a collective to give an idea of how much stuff was added that ultimately isn't really related to the story you presumably went into it watching it for. There's just so much going on here. This wasn't even all of it, and it just makes you go, why am I watching a couple LARPing as husband and wife for 30 minutes? I thought this was the War of the Worlds. The writer just wanted to add in so much of his own stuff that's ultimately diminished instead of enhanced the adaptation. I think a good example of this are the future parts of the show. The latter 2 episodes especially are continuously interrupted by them, showing us how Britain has never recovered from the invasion due to the red weed infecting the crops and water supply and all that. The idea of changing the ending or wanting to explore the invasion's aftermath isn't bad in itself, but the way this concept was executed here was just terrible in my opinion. It always just came across to me as one of those things that filmmakers do because they think it's clever, but instead all it does is interrupt the good parts. I guess this is more a criticism of the editing than the writing actually. Which brings me onto another big criticism of this show. It's really slow, and the future segments are the worst when it comes to this, as along with the water and crops being affected by the red weed the Martians left behind, it apparently also caused the characters to develop a condition where they have to pause for 10 seconds after every sentence. It's like, oh, you survived the invasion. Yes, I managed to get out of Woking. What did you do then? I hid in a basement for a fortnight. It's like they have brain fog, which I guess would make sense to be fair. I actually rewatched most of the show, variating between ×2 and 1.5 playback speed, and yet even literally watching it at double speed, it still felt slow. There were moments where I would go to set it to 2 times speed, because I thought I'd changed it back, and I saw that actually no, it was already going at 2 times speed. So, BBC's The War of the Worlds is a show that is such a contrasted series. I don't know of any other War of the Worlds that divides my mind so much. Usually it's just, here's a bad version, here's a good version. This one is really good, and also accurate in so many ways that most others aren't. But then it's filled with so much random, irrelevant, or just downright bad stuff. In my opinion, with ill intentions, which is why I was so negative about it the first time around. I praise versions decisions that are bad but give a good effort. But with this, it's not like, oh well yeah, well they tried but they did a really bad job. It's like, they wrote this with such disdain. Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying they. He wrote it with such disdain. It's crazy how one guy can single-handedly drag down a project so much that what actually could have been so good and is so good in so many ways is heavily tainted by a singular individual. I mean, I'm assuming this is the fault of the writer, maybe I'm mistaken, but all the bad things about this show seem to be down to one person making bad writing and bizarre plot choices, and ultimately it just made it so pretentious, and that's what I don't like about it. So I think my final analysis is that this, what I perceive as ill intention and terrible writing, heavily undermines what is otherwise the many great aspects of the BBC's War of the Worlds.